Thank you all for joining us again. Yes, you're welcome to still continue enjoying your lunch while you listen. Thank you for taking the time to be here and support our wonderful student presenters as well. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce panel 3, Truth-Telling in Contested Times. Our first presenter is Richard Martin. Richard will be presenting on the colonial legacy in Gaza toward a liberative Christian ethic. We warmly welcome you, Rick.
Good afternoon. I am honored and humbled to be here today, and we are gathered here under the banner of being unafraid. And today, there is perhaps no place on earth where the need for unafraid truth-telling is more desperate than the Gaza Strip. We are currently witnessing a moment in which the language of reconstruction is being used to mask the reality of erasure, as substantiated by the recent 2025 Palestinian Center for the Paulson Survey research poll. The escalating crisis in the Gaza Strip serves as a harrowing litmus test for contemporary Christian ethics. It is not merely a localized regional conflict or a failure of modern diplomacy. It is a profound moral catastrophe that reveals the most devastating lessons of the colonial empire. And this paper proceeds from the conviction that Christian ethics is not a neutral observation of competitive narratives, but a rigorous prophetic reflection on how moral practices are embodied in the lives of the most vulnerable. Historically, much of the Western Christian ethics has been complicit in empire utilizing just war traditions or state-centric frameworks to sanitize systematic violence. However, a sensitive and forthright engagement with the Palestinian struggle requires a shift towards a liberated framework. And by centering the voices of decoloniality, embodied dignity, and land as theology, this paper seeks to dismantle the structures of coloniality and offer a constructive ethics toolbox that affirms the sacred, the ancestral rights of the Palestinian people to thrive in their soil. To analyze this horrific treatment of the Palestinians, one must first name the mechanism of their oppressant coloniality. And while colonialism refers to a specific historical period, coloniality refers to the enduring structures of power, knowledge, and beings that persist long after the official end of the colonial rule. George Rigor argues that theology and empire are fundamental, intertwined, often providing a moral cover for systemic domination. In Gaza, this logic is manifest in the way state security is elevated to a divine mandate, effectively placing the Palestinians outside the realm of moral concern. When ethical frameworks are used to normalize displacement, they become tools of coloniality. And this paper asserts that the worst lessons of empire are learned when we allow the suffering of the entire population to be framed as a political necessity rather than a moral failure. To counter this, we must adopt a forthright stance that names the normalization as a structural sin that violates the very core of the Imago Dei. A sensitive ethic must be willing to disrupt the comfort of the powerful. As Tracy West provides the methodology for this through her framework of disruptive Christian ethics, West insists that the intentional how of our work must be rooted in truth-telling about racialized violence. And in the Gaza Strip context, a disruptive ethic refuses to accept sanitized reports of collateral damage or the passive language of conflict. Instead, it adopts a defiant spirituality, a posture that recognizes the image of God in those whose lives are treated as expendable by the machinery of empire. The sin of hiding is a moral weight of global silence. And in analyzing the lessons of this global empire, we must also look at the moral passivity of the global community. Susan Dunphy provides a crucial corrective to traditional views of sin by identifying the sin of hiding, the failure to take up one's moral agency and the refusal to speak truth to power in the face of blatant injustice. In the context of Gaza, the sin of hiding is manifest in the international community's tendency to remain neutral or to offer balanced critiques while horrific treatment continues unabated. Dunphy argues that for those in positions of relative safety, hiding behind academic or diplomatic jargon is a form of complicity. A forthright liberative ethic demands that we move from the sin of hiding towards a more prophetic lament that names structural injustice for what it is and the affront to the Creator. The authority of Scripture from empire to resistance, the Bible has often weaponized in the Middle East to justify land conquest and ethnic exclusion. Therefore, a liberative ethic requires a fundamental shift in how we understand scriptural authority. Following Miguel de la Torre, this paper adopts a hermeneutic of the margins, centering the perspectives of the oppressed rather than those of the powerful. And this method asserts that God's voice is found most clearly, not in the degrees of kings or the border of states, but in the cries of the dispossessed and the refugee. Gail Lee provides a critical layer to this by exposing American Orientalism, the tendency of Westerners to other Middle Eastern people through harmful archetypes and colonial tropes. And when we read the story of Jael or other biblical figures, Yi teaches us to see the subversion of empire from within the Gaza. In Gaza, a forthright use of scripture does not seek proof texts for modern statehood. It seeks the God who tabernacles with the refugee in the tent. And this centers the voices of those who, like the biblical ancestors, struggle to maintain their humanity in the shadow of the dominant empire. The sensitivity core of this paper lies in the recognition that the land has the blood of its people. Teresa Delgado's decolonial theology lends credibility to this claim. Delgado argues that land is not merely a commodity or a territory, but a theological category, and this sacred ancestral bond defines a people's relationship with the divine and their own history. For Palestinians, the soil of Gaza is not just property, it's a repository of identity. To uproot a people from their soil is to commit a theological injury that transcends political belief. And this land-centric ethic must be coupled with an ethic of the broken body. Amy Kenny's "My Body is Not a Prayer Request" reminds us that the church often treats disabled bodies as problems to be fixed, rather than the sites of dignity and divine revelation. In Gaza, where military violence has created a generation of newly disabled individuals, a peace initiative that does not place disability justice at its core is a failure of Christian ethics. Christian Tai's work on peace and war further challenges the sterile, militaristic ethics of the West, calling instead for a political theology that centers the victims of war and the physical cost of empire. The Palestinian claims that their people are in the soil is also an ecological reality. Cynthia Moy Lobida's work on climate debt provides a robust framework for the understanding the environmental cost of the occupation. Moabita argues that imperial powers owe a moral and material debt for the ecological destruction brought upon marginalized populations. And in Gaza, the destruction of water aquifers, the uprooting of the ancient olive groves, and the contamination of the soil are forms of ecological theft. A forthright ethic must recognize that a peaceful initiative cannot be successful without climate justice, for there is a debt owed to the Palestinian people for the environmental ruin caused by decades of siege and militarism. The intentional how of this paper, if you will, is summarized in a constructive ethics toolbox, moving from descriptive critique to a transformative action. Land as theology, affirming the sacred, the ancestral link between the Palestinian people and their soil. Disruptive solidarity, the actively interpreting the colonial narrative empire. And this means speaking truth to power and refusing the sin of hiding in the face of systemic violence. And the intersectional dignity, ensuring that any piece of this initiative is led by those at the intersection of displacement and disability, prioritizing the leadership of those whose bodies bear the deepest marks of the conflict. This paper has argued that Christian ethics, committed to a vision of a society in which all can thrive, must intentionally abandon traditional neutrality and construct a liberated framework to engage with the crisis. The first step in this construction was a rigorous decolonial critique, drawing on George Rigor's and Don Campier's warnings about empire to dismantle narratives of exceptionalism that obscured the systemic nature of violence. This critique was further energized by adopting Tracy West's disruptive Christian ethics, which insists that a truthful diagnosis of structural racism is a prerequisite for ethical action. The resulting liberative ethic moved beyond mere critique to articulate a viable path forward by embracing embodied dignity and the non-negotiable right to existence for the most marginalized. Ultimately, the paper's intentional toolbox provides the necessary principles for a genuine resolution. Land as theology as its center. We affirm the sacred link between the people and the place and refute the colonial commodification of territory. And by applying the principles of defiant solidarity and embodied dignity, I guarantee that a Palestinian peace initiative prioritizes the full liberation, not just momentary freedom, of every person, especially the disabled, whose bodies bear the deepest mark of this conflict. This paper and project matter because a Christian ethic that fails to expose and only by embracing the liberative contextual method that the church can align its spiritual practice with its moral vocation and actively co-create a world in which all can thrive. This disruptive work aligns with Emily Towns' assertion that ethics is an art of doing the work that our souls must have. Towns differentiates between the superficial peace and a deep liberation. A sensitivity ethic recognizes the profound trauma and generational soul loss of the Palestinian people. With a forthright ethic demands the structural transformation required for their survival. We cannot reach a good society through context-blind ethics. We must confront the colonial demon that haunt our global structures and refuse to accept any peace that is built upon the erasure of a people. More than a geopolitical dispute, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict touches upon the core of what it means to live with dignity and freedom, challenging us to consider how empires and their legacies shape our current world. As gut-wrenching as this conflict is to so many, as leaders, activists, peacemakers, the objective must be to advocate for structures and ideologies that foster
Rick,
life.
Rick, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I see that you're not seeing your chat right now. Would you
Ah,
be able to wrap up pretty soon because we are over 3 minutes.
okay,
But I would let you know because you weren't able to see the chat. Sorry to
all right,
interrupt.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we must engage with our sisters and brothers and love each other as Christ has loved us. The foundation of this faith is community with each other and across all boundaries. Understanding boundaries allows us to take whatever distance we need. We learn about the various cultural contexts and come to love each other and be safe in doing so. In 10,000 years, will anyone's sins matter? No. The here and now matter, the struggle for goodness. The next generation who will fight a new struggle for goodness will raise still higher the dignity of man. That was by Dick Francis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate you for concluding your wonderful paper. Thank you so much. Now we will go move on to our next presenter. Jayne Parks will be presenting on casting the light on Babylon, epistemological justice and ethics from the margins. Jayne, we warmly welcome you.
Thank you. In The Nature and Destiny of Man, Reinhold Niebuhr articulates a Christian realism that begins from restraint. Suspicious of materialist analysis, Niebuhr dismisses what he calls, quote, the too simple Marxian interpretation of the primacy of economic motives, unquote, and reframes social struggle as a moral drama rooted in individual insecurity. For Niebuhr, quote, the whole history of racial, national, religious, and other social struggles, unquote, is a commentary on human self-righteousness, where any, quote, hope for a cooperative society is far short of the real truth, unquote. From this vantage point, oppression is not primarily a historical system to be dismantled, but a perennial moral condition to be managed. This orientation does more than temper political expectation. It relocates ethical authority away from material conditions and toward abstraction. Suffering becomes a test of character rather than an indictment of social arrangements. Christian ethics, in this frame, disciplines hope rather than confronting exploitation. The result is a posture that cautions against overreach while leaving the structural causes of deprivation under-examined. Tracy C. West, in her chapter on Niebuhr and Beyond the Pale, Reading Ethics from the Margins, exposes the racial stakes of this move. She identifies, quote, racially uninterrogated Niebuhrian themes with serious difficulties for envisioning anti-racist political change, unquote. Niebuhr's framework, she argues, risks belittling past white supremacist injustices while acceding to current ones, unquote. By spiritualizing oppression into universal insecurity, Christian realism stabilizes racial hierarchy even as it names moral failure. J. Sakai offers a sharply different register. Though not a theologian, Sakai's Settlers, the mythology of the white proletariat, is framed by a sustained concern with moral authority and historical accountability. Sakai insists on, quote, throwing the light of historical materialism on Babylon itself, unquote. He warns that dominant epistemologies preserve themselves by incorporating critique without surrendering authority. Even when the imperial center concedes that its history is partial, it seeks to remedy the problem by addition rather than reorganization. Quote, like jujitsu, Sakai writes, our original demand that our separate and unique histories be uncovered and recognized is now being used to throw us off our ideological balance, unquote. Inclusion without a shift in authority becomes disciplinary, rather than liberatory. The problem is not simply representation, but epistemic control. This essay argues that Christian ethics must undergo an epistemic reversal. Ethical authority must be grounded in the lived knowledge of those rendered marginal by social, political, and theological structures. Marginalized communities cannot remain additive figures within Christian ethics. They must become its primary interpreters. Without this shift, Christian ethics risks reproducing the very oppression it claims to resist. Epistemology thus becomes a moral problem. Who is authorized to interpret is inseparable from whose lives are treated as normative. Miguel A. de la Torre develops this claim explicitly across his work. In Latina/social ethics, moving beyond Eurocentric moral thinking, he argues that Christian ethics has been shaped by a Eurocentric moral imagination capable of universalizing its own norms while ignoring imperial violence. Quote, "Claiming God's patience in the face of the hunger of others," he writes, "is definitely a middle-class privilege," unquote. Ethical neutrality is not an achievement, but a social location, insulated from material consequence. In reading the Bible from the margins, de la Torre insists that interpretation is always socially situated. Quote, "Reading the Bible from the social location of oppression," unquote, is not a contextual preference, but a methodological necessity. Oppression reveals what privilege can afford not to notice. He further argues that, quote, "Those who are disenfranchised are in a position to understand the biblical text better," unquote, precisely because survival sharpens perception. Where dominant readers presume justice as already secured, quote, "Oppressed groups begin with their need for liberation," unquote. By contrast, theology produced from positions of power often neutralizes scripture. De la Torre observes that, quote, "Reading the Bible to justify one's social location results in a spiritual or metaphorical reading rather than a material reading," unquote. When passages threaten wealth or empire, they are defanged. Quote, "When a passage seems to condemn riches or the wealthy, it is read metaphorically so that the text can mean something else," unquote. The gospel is rendered safe for those who benefit from inequality. Liberationist interpretation reverses this flow of authority. Quote, "The gospel is for those who are poor and oppressed," de la Torre writes, "and through them the message is extended toward those who profit from the marginalized," unquote. Interpretation must move toward a, quote, "concrete community-based plan of action," unquote. Insight alone is insufficient. Accountability completes interpretation. De la Torre also demonstrates how epistemic authority is suppressed in lived interaction. Quote, "The power to label becomes the power to control and the power to silence," unquote. When marginalized subjects articulate harm, their claims are dismissed on tone rather than substance. Being cast as angry becomes a mechanism by which critique is nullified. In this maneuver, injustice is displaced by temperament. Structural diagnosis is recast as emotional excess. This silencing is inseparable from political economy. As De la Torre observes, quote, "For our economy to work, an acceptable unemployment rate is required to keep wages depressed," unquote. Exploitation is stabilized through normalized precarity. Yet dominant ethics often prefer moral exhortation to material diagnosis. Calls for patience function as ethical demands placed on the oppressed for the comfort of those who benefit from delay. Even liberationist frameworks can stop short of rupture. In Latina/social ethics, de la Torre critiques Walter Rauschenbusch's social gospel framework, noting that, quote, Apparently, the social crisis of imperialism, the massacre of colonial subjects, and the US turn from republic to empire are never mentioned in his assessment as to what exactly is the social crisis, unquote. The danger is not insincerity, but misidentification. When empire is omitted from the diagnosis, ethical reform can proceed while the deeper architecture of violence remains intact. Across queer, womanist, disability, and post-colonial scholarship, a shared insistence emerges. Ethical knowledge arises from embodied life under oppression. These scholars do not merely diversify Christian ethics, they reconstitute it. The question then is not inclusion, but governance. Who sets the terms of moral truth? John Dominic Cresson's God and Empire, Jesus Against Rome, Then and Now, clarifies what is at stake when Christian ethics forgets its conditions of emergence. In discussing the historical Jesus, Cresson writes that, quote, whether you start or end with the Roman Empire is always there, unquote. Empire is not background context, but the field within which ethical discourse is formed and contested. Cresson presses further, quote, beneath the problem of empire is the problem of justice, but beneath the problem of justice is the problem of violence, unquote. In this frame, Jesus is not a private moralist offering portable virtues for stable societies, but, quote, a nonviolent revolutionary, unquote, articulating a new moral imagination. A moment of imperial exposure when hegemonic legitimacy is strained and elite impunity is demystified should invite Christian ethics into renewed ethical invention, not constraint. The question becomes, what kind of ethic can tell the truth about power without reproducing it in the act of naming? Epistemological justice, therefore, is not a methodological preference, but a moral demand. In a moment when imperial normalcy reveals its fractures, the refusal to relocate ethical authority is itself an ethical choice. Christian ethics cannot pursue liberation while centering dominant perspectives without contradiction. If Christian ethics is to remain faithful to its origins, it must recover its vantage point. Ethical authority grounded in the knowledge carried by oppressed communities, with marginalized people no longer treated as secondary witnesses, but as primary interpreters. Only by casting the light from the margins onto Babylon itself can Christian ethics name oppression without participating in its preservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayne. Appreciate your wonderful presentation. Now I warmly welcome Reverend Robert Wiseman, who will speak about rooted in love, renewed in relationship, reweaving the relational body politic through theological dialogue of love, power, and public health justice. We warmly welcome Reverend Bobby.
We are not living only in polarized times. We are living in relationally fractured times. And what we call polarization may be a symptom and not the root. Before I go any further, I need to acknowledge those who root me, my grandmama and my granddaddy. John Brown Sr., Dorothy Mae Brown, Alice Childs and Arthur S. Childs, my mama and my daddy, and Robert L. Wiseman Sr., my namesake, because none of us, nor me, arrive here alone. What they gave me was not just life, but a way of being in relationship. Even as I stand here, I'm not standing by myself. I'm standing in relationship, in inheritance, in covenant, rooted in love and renewed in relationship. When we lose sight of covenant, we begin to lose sight of one another. When we lose sight of one another, what emerges is not just a disagreement, but disconnection. which means beneath the noise, beneath the debates, beneath the data, there remains a quieter question. What does it mean to belong to one another in a time like this? And that is the question of belonging, of disconnection, of what we owe one another. That leads me to this thought, this claim. Public health crises today are not only technical failures, yet relational and theological failures, requiring what I call a covenantal public health ethic. For if we misdiagnose disconnection, we will misbuild care. And if that is true, then what we are seeing in our systems is not accidental. It's revealing. Public health in this moment has become a mirror of our collective disconnections. I've sat in rooms where care was technically delivered, but no one felt seen or cared. Where the metric said success, but the person left still alone. This suggests something deeper is happening. Because we have built, all of us, we have built systems that we know how to count a body, but we don't know how to care for it. And when that gap becomes normalized, as we've heard from the earlier wonderful colleagues, we have to name it for what it is. Not only a systems failure, but a relational failure and a theological failure. When efficiency replaces empathy and distance replaces presence, public health becomes technocratic maintenance rather than covenantal care. If we continue to misdiagnose disconnection, we will continue to misbuild care, which means we cannot simply adjust the system. We have to learn how to see it differently. To see differently, we must reframe the problem itself, not simply as access or inefficiency, but as a disruption in what sustains life together, which raises a deeper question. What actually holds life in common? I want to suggest three interwoven realities: blood, water, love. Not as metaphor, but as mandate. Because what we are ultimately talking about is how life flows or fails to flow. And that flow begins with blood. Blood reminds us that we are already bound together. Life depends on circulation, blood circulation. And when circulation is blocked, guess what? Suffering follows. We see it where resources flow, where they stagnate, that we've heard from the earlier presenters today, and where communities are left to bleed. The epidemic and pandemics that we have all experienced did not create inequity, and they revealed inequity and inequities. And so blood becomes both diagnosis and demand. Justice must circulate. But naming circulation leads us further to question of conditions. This is where water comes in. Water shifts the question from flow to conditions. What makes life livable, conditionable? Clean water, safe housing, access to care, environmental safety. These are not privileges. They are covenantal obligations. Because water reminds us that health is not individual. It is ecological. It is shared. But even shared conditions are not enough without something to organize them. Which means what we are facing is not only a systems problem or challenge, it is a question of what governs us. And that is where love enters, not as feeling, but as framework. Love as infrastructure, governance, policy, design. Because systems either embody love or they operationalize its absence. And if we are honest, some of what we call policy is love withheld and suffering organized, which means love cannot remain abstract. It must be structured, it must be lived. When we hold together connection, conditions, and responsibility, something begins to take form. If blood names our connection, and water names our conditions, and love names our responsibility, then we need an ethic that can hold them together. And so we arrive here, not by abstraction, but by necessity, to a covenantal public health ethic, grounded in blood, shared vulnerability, water, shared conditions, love, shared responsibility, not abstract, operational, not aspirational, measurable, not distant, embodied and livable. And if this is the ethic, then what remains is not simply understanding, but response. We began with disconnection, but we do not end it there. What we are being invited into is reconnection with responsibility. At the center of this word is a simple, unsettling conviction. Love still works. Dare I say, the blood still works. But only when it circulates like blood, flows like water, and is structured into public life as justice and belonging. Because every one of us, at some point, will need a system to care for us, not as, but as lived and living reality, because we cannot care for our own selves. Which means the question is no longer whether we understand the problem, but whether we are willing to live differently. The balcony is no longer enough. The circle awaits. Come down, not as observers, but as participants. Come down and join the circulation. So my final question that I'll leave us with, not with closure, but with responsibility. What would it require? Not in theory, not in policy, practice, and power, for love, justice, and belonging to become operational realities. And the last question that I'm going to leave us with. If love is already the answer, what truth are we still unwilling to confess? Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Bobby. Appreciate you for your support and your paper. And also, I would like to now open the space for conversation. The Q&A portion is now open. We are opening the chat at this point following the student presentations and before the faculty response so that, our faculty are, our brilliant Dr. Joshua can remain focused during his response while also engaging the questions that are coming in. But you're welcome to share your questions and comments directly in the chat. So if the question comes to you at any point, please send it to Symposium Q&A and we will forward those questions to the faculty moderator as well. And then when we do have Q&A, due to time restraints, the faculty facilitator will guide the flow of the conversation and may prioritize certain questions. Well, I would like to now warmly welcome Dr. Joshua Bartholomew for his response. Well, we welcome you, Joshua.
Thank you, Dr. So. Thank you for all the hard work that you have put into organizing this symposium. And thank you also to the panelists. It's a pleasure to actually see you for the first time and put your faces to your work, Richard, Jayne, and Bobby. But I definitely am grateful for your thoughtful, courageous, and deeply engaging presentations. It's a privilege to be in conversation with you and to witness the important work that you're doing. I'm also honored for the opportunity to participate in dialogue at the Unafraid Symposium. This space where we can think critically and challenge one another as we grow in community together embodies what it means to practice truth-telling in contested times. So I'll jump right into it. I know that time may be of the essence. You know, across all three papers, I observe a shared rejection of neutrality, really an emphasis on a principles stance and a commitment to reimagine ethics in relation to lived realities, whether through decolonial critique, epistemological justice, or relational public theology. Each of you, in your own way, is engaged in the difficult but necessary work of truth-telling, naming what is often obscured, interrogating dominant narratives, and asking what it means for ethics to be accountable to those most affected by social injustice. So my comments are offered in this same spirit. I'm aiming to constructively advance each of your projects towards greater clarity, rigor, and transformative potential. And I'll begin with Rick Martin. Rick Martin's paper on the crisis of, in the Gaza Strip and liberative Christian ethics. I want to affirm the relevance of your topic, particularly right now in our current political moment and reality as a nation. And the strength of your decolonial analysis, particularly your identification of coloniality as an ongoing structure shaping land, bodies, and theological imagination. Your focus on the violence of settler colonial displacement and the erasure of human beings is both necessary and urgent. And furthermore, your advocacy for a liberative Christian ethic that centers embodied dignity and land as theology is both powerful and a reclamation project, really. What stayed with me the most was your attention to the weight of global silence that facilitates moral passivity. That insight is deeply important. And it reminds us that injustice is not only perpetuated through action, but also through inaction, through neutrality, and through the refusal to speak. Your work calls us to recognize silence itself as an ethical position. And that is a critical contribution in a time when so much is deliberately obscured. Consequently, the topic of settler colonialism relates to processes of human race making that prompts a deeper question for us. To what extent can Christianity become truly liberative within the matrix of coloniality without undergoing its own decolonization? Here, I'm considering how the category of religion itself was developed within Western philosophical and colonial frameworks that privileged Euro-Christian priorities, principles, and politics while excluding indigenous and African cultural heritages and social imaginaries. In this case, religion is already a racialized category, even when race is not explicitly on the table. Such a claim has implications for Christianity's doctrines of humankind and creation, for example. Thus, particularly in the context of ecological justice and disruptive intersectional solidarity, the task of truth-telling may also require Christianity to tell the truth about itself, its formation, its complexity, its complicity, and its limitations. The question is not only about how Christianity signifies liberation, but also how its signs can be transformed at the level of its grammar, assumptions, and claims to solidarity. Without this deeper epistemic shift, there's a risk that even liberative theology may unintentionally reproduce Euro-Christian subjectivity in unexpected ways. What would it mean for Christianity to be accountable to this history in ways that fundamentally reshape its own self-understanding? Now, turning to Jayne Parks' paper on epistemological justice. I want to deeply affirm the compelling and necessary nature of your argument. One of its strong elements is the accuracy of your epistemological critique. You do an excellent job of showing how dominant theological frameworks reflect the politics of knowledge production. Your insistence that ethical authority must be relocated to the margins, and your critique of dominant frameworks that obscure structural injustice is itself a form of truth-telling that exposes how knowledge and power are intertwined. Your engagement with thinkers such as Reinhold Niebuhr, Miguel de la Torre, my PhD advisor, and Tracy West effectively demonstrates that epistemology is a moral issue. The authority to interpret reality is inseparable from the ways in which justice is conceptualized. I simply offer a constructive methodological resource. While centering marginalized communities is essential, it's important to not treat the margins as monolithic or inherently unified, because we all know that marginalized communities do not all share the same theological or ethical commitments and visions of liberation. Or to put differently, because all skin folk ain't kinfolk, and there are internal differences, tensions, and even negative internalizations of socially constructed divisions within marginalized communities, including anti-Blackness and other forms of domination. Truth-telling requires precision. Womanist theology offers a critical methodological intervention at this juncture. Womanist scholars remind us to attend not only to marginality in general, but specifically to those who care about community and are also the most dispossessed in society, particularly Black women and Black trans women, as primary ethical starting points. The insight is that when those most marginalized in community are lifted and liberated, the conditions for broader liberation are established. Therefore, the task is not merely to center the margins, but to discern which voices within marginalized communities are guiding our ethical frameworks, and whether those voices are oriented toward collective liberation and active resistance to domination. This level of methodological clarity offers a sort of compass to navigate difference for the self-direction and wholeness or unity of marginalized voices moving towards epistemological justice. And finally, in response to Bobby's paper on the relational body politic and covenantal public health, I want to affirm the generative and creative nature of your framework. Your assertion that public health is not merely technical, but also relational and theological, and that love must be operationalized as infrastructure, is a powerful act of truth-telling in a context where care is often reduced to efficiency, metrics, and management. Your vision of moral cardiology, the circulation of care, trust, justice, and belonging, offers a compelling reimagining of how systems might sustain life. So I offer my comments in the spirit of strengthening what is already a robust and promising project. Specifically, I want to encourage deeper engagement with the lived material dimensions of public theology. Public theology is not only something we theorize, it's something we enact within concrete social, political, and economic systems. Here I'm reminded of my seminary professor, Dr. James Cone, the father of Black theology, who described the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the greatest public theologian of our time and a central progenitor of Black theology. King's truth-telling was not abstract. It was embodied in his confrontation with the political and economic structures shaping people's lives. His leadership culminated in the Poor People's Campaign, which demonstrated how theology could become a direct critique of economic inequality and a call for structural transformation. So I invite you, Bobby, to consider more explicitly the political and economic context in which your vision of public health is situated. In our current capitalist system, where access to healthcare is determined by insurance tied to employment, where profit-driven systems influence treatment decisions and access to care, and where life-saving medications are priced according to market trends rather than human need, what structural economic changes would be necessary for your model to become real? If love is to function as infrastructure, how do we tell the truth about the economic systems that currently organize care around profit rather than collective well-being? And how might your framework be strengthened through deeper engagement with liberationist, anti-colonial, and post-colonial theological traditions that already name these dynamics? Across all three papers, what I see is a shared and urgent message, a call to move beyond abstract, impersonal, and detached social ethics toward an approach rooted in lived existential realities and oriented towards sentiments of collective liberation. The common thread, as I see it, is this: truth-telling in contested times requires transformation across three interrelated dimensions: the epistemological, the structural and systemic, and the theological. Epistemologically, we must tell the truth about who has the authority to know and interpret, keeping in mind that a decolonial ethic without epistemic transformation risks reproducing empire. Structurally, we must tell the truth about the economic and political systems that organize life and death, remembering that an epistemic shift without structural change risks remaining symbolic. And theologically, we must tell the truth about how our traditions and categories have been shaped by and have participated in colonial and imperial logics. We must remain aware that a relational vision without economic and theological grounding risks being co-opted. If any of these dimensions are left unaddressed, the work of liberation remains unduly incomplete. So the invitation across these papers is not simply to rethink ethics, but to reimagine the conditions under which ethical truth-telling becomes possible, to build frameworks that are accountable to those most impacted and that are willing to transform not only our ideas, but also our systems and collective ways of being and relating to one another. Thank you all once again for your important contributions.
Thank you, Dr. Bartholomew, for your response. We will now open the space for conversation.
So I'm curious to know, what inspired, and this is for all of you, what inspired your particular vision of ethics?
When here in the U.S., news hit of the public health system being cut and budget cuts because of being a person effectively living with 4 chronic medical conditions, direct receiving services from a public health system, and babies, teenagers, middle-aged folks directly suffering, got called out of retirement to look at something and to advocate in a new way in a new generation. And so it began by a simple phone call. Because the part of the ethic I talked about today, I'm currently living because of those who poured into me. So it's on its new iteration, where part of this began through 2 different professors here at PSR. And so this ethic is not something abstract for me. It's something that ties me to multiple communities of past, present, and future.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question, and I suppose I'll go next. I've been organizing politically in the last couple of years, particularly after the second election of Trump. And as I was in socialist organizing, something that I realized is that whether it was myself as a trans woman or other marginal perspectives in the room, I found that our perspectives were able to be stated, but they weren't allowed to be formative. In other words, anytime a perspective from the margins was offered that might shift the common sense of the room, our perspectives were calibrated, they were constrained, and the sort of epistemological center, the epistemological authority was ultimately reasserted. And so in my organizing efforts, I learned that the knowledge itself is not alone what's important, but who has the authority in the room to form the common sense of the room, or who has the ability to be heard. A particular socialist group I was in, they had what's called a progressive stack, where they this one that I'm talking about, where they marginalized perspectives are prioritized. And something I challenged them before I left the group was, do we allow marginalized voices to shape the room, or do we just let them talk first? And so that led me down the path of epistemic justice and learning about how epistemology is itself a moral question. And so thank you for the question.
For me, I over the last several years, I've just been watching, like we all have, current events, and it just seems like the administration and the United States has been tying ourselves blindly to the decisions made by Israel and not asking questions. And Gaza Strip is kind of like an open air prison and has been for nearly 40 years. And it's almost like Israel has forgotten their past. And when you have mothers arrested and put in confinement, and she has children at home, they're developing rebels and militants. And it's not very much rocket science behind that. And so when we start aligning ourselves with governments that are practicing erasure right now and supporting them with that bombs to destroy that entire area, it just got to me. And I just don't think Christian ethics can be neutral any further. We need to talk. We're complicit, and we need to speak out. Power is truth to power. So that's why it got me going.
No, I deeply appreciate your answers. And it's great to learn more about you. I also, your passions for current events resonates with me. Also with organizing, there were lots of experiences I had in organizing that also shaped my scholarship and the things that, I felt called to do in the world. So I also relate with that, Jayne. And Bob, we've been having lots of conversations lately. I've been getting to know you as well. So I definitely see how your work is informed by your personal life and the undertakings that you're also called to do. I want to shift our attention to the chat. I see Manny has a question here in the chat that we can lift up right now. How does interfaith and intercultural dialogue fit to complement the ecumenical discourse? How might that dialogue be engaged strategically in each of your communities of care? So, that's an open question. Anybody can answer it. If anybody wants to go first, please feel free.
If I may, Manny, I'm in the process of discernment right now, and I'm in southeast Nebraska, but I've selected a church countryside in Omaha. It's on a 29-acre campus, and it includes a mosque and a synagogue, and of course, Countryside, a UCC church. And this work that I'm starting just gives me a lot of inspiration because I've already visited with the imam, and he's really excited and about where we can promote this and basically educate everybody so that we're all represented at the table.
And I'll go. There is dialogue that will be coming because, ironically, there have been a number of conversations here in the last 8 days of a proposed project that will hopefully receive 5-year funding, that will have 16 different sites, both ecumenically, denominationally, socioeconomically, that will begin to look at some of the various things talked about in this framework and that fellow colleagues have lifted up. Because part of the thing has been, yes, there's the framework, yes, there's the passion, yes, there's the thought. Now, let's move out the kitchen and get it to the cart, out to the people. And so to find a way to make that happen, I changed my phrasing real quick in my head on that one, to make it happen. And so to go from just the thought to now the actualization, which required vulnerability and openness between the collaborators to come together, and the mechanics. Jayne, kind of like how you're talking about when the room is opened up, all that stuff. And so that's where it's at, where it's getting a new understanding and a new comfort, where hopefully no one will be the tokenistic voice or the outsidic voice.
I appreciate those responses. I'll offer one too. It's interfaith questions are I think crucial for the Christian context, because as we talk about, say, coloniality and Rick's essay, the voyage of 1492, this overdetermined historical year was a Christianizing mission, under a sort of universal banner. And so I think, as I would hesitate to give a universal answer, but a particular one, as scholars, as academics, as theologians, as people with the privilege to do this work. I think that many of us work to develop theologies, epistemologies, or otherwise reflect our own social social location. But Bobby was talking about responsibility, and it made me think about how responsibility for me, or accountability, is where action flows from, and it starts with acknowledging your own social location. And for example, us being scholars in the United States, what I find to be that produces the most urgent, the most truth-telling scholarship is when there's a scholarly emphasis on uncovering oppressed epistemologies, shining a light on oppressed epistemologies, rather than simply developing our own. And so, as much as it is a valuable project to develop theologies and epistemologies, I think it's just as valuable to find out which epistemologies have been destroyed, erased, marginalized, in order to build this modern world where a universalizing Christian mission was possible. In Spain, for example, Sephardic Jews had to be exiled in order for that national project to gain steam historically. So, if that answers the question, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And there were several things you said that related to, your specific answer right there. I think there is a correlation between the sort of active erasure that we're all living in and the intentional reclamation to build alternative epistemologies that can become common sense. At one point were common sense, right? But have been sort of replaced by the dominant culture's understanding of social order and status quo. And there was also something you said, Jayne, about, who gets to determine what becomes common sense. That's a very intentional practice um, when we're up against empire, coloniality, and so on, right? The goal here is really to be intentional about creating a counterculture. When I was an organizer, when I did organizing, that was part of a sort of practices. We would go on retreats and really put in work to create a structure for how to do this work beyond the times that we would be together. So much of what you got, what you all have presented requires grounding practices that carry us forward when nobody's looking, right? Because of how society sort of socializes us into actively forgetting that these ways of thinking, these ways of being and doing even exist. Um, Let me see. Let me look at these questions. Okay. Let me ask another question real quick. And really this kind of, piggybacks off what I just said. How do you sustain the commitment to truth telling when it becomes difficult, risky, or contested?
The truth is, I step away for a minute because it is a burden, it is a weight. And if I've learned, if I don't step away for a minute just to reground, regroup, I'm ineffective for my own self first. If I'm ineffective for my own self, those who I'm servicing, in service of, and servicing with, doing no good. And I've had to learn that that is the real, for me at least, that is a stronger part of both the advocacy, the organizing, and the work that needs to be done and called to and for.
It's like an intentional separation to
It,
reintegrate. Okay.
yes, with purpose and clarity, and not with fluff, but saying, no, I'm off grid. When I get back is when I get back. Plain and simple.
If I may speak to this, I'm in here in National Christianism and Christianity nationalism, and it's very lonely here. And to piggyback on a question that what can PSR do? A couple of years ago when I was right new at PSR, President David said, at some magical point, your minds will be blown here at PSR. And he was right. And I'm sure we all agree with that. And I'm so grateful to my um, fellow students, to my faculty, to President David, to our dean, to doing what you all do to keep me energized. And because it's very lonely here. And I just am grateful every night because the battle is really hard. And but we need to do this because the world is moving at a faster clip today.
Yeah.
And it's not like it was 80 years ago.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need people are hurting and dying, and we need to build a better world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you, Dr. Joshua, for leading this wonderful conversation. We would love to hear more, but we noticed that, even though we want to stay here forever, but we have a lot of things still waiting us. So please feel free to leave things on chat as well. We're going to leave the chat open during the faculty synthesis later after this break. So, we're going to have a conversation with these outstanding faculty responders. So stay tuned.